Welcome to the monthly BV Magazine podcast, your genuine slice, as ever, of rural Dorset life. This is episode 1 for August 2023. It's hello from me, Terry Bennett.
And hello from me, Jenny Devitt.
In this episode, we'll have a selection of your letters to the editor.
Adam Woolcott of the Dorset Wildlife Trust is a fan of that striking bird of prey, the red kite.
Simon Hoare poses the intriguing question as to whether every town needs a town centre, and goes on to answer it in the affirmative.
Mike Chapman of the LibDems says it's time for change, time for the grown-ups.
Labour's Pat Osborne condemns the government's recent decision to grant new oil and gas licences, and argues that its policy of achieving net zero by 2050 is doomed to fail.
And Ken Huggins of the Greens talks about the good, the bad and the downright ugly. And we have part 2 of the interview with co-director of the Bournemouth University Duropolis Dig, Paul Cheatham.
But first, here's our editor, Laura.
We'll barely have time to celebrate the fact the BV turns 3 this month. 3 years! How is that even possible? We have a packed few weeks ahead. As I write, we're just 10 days away from the second Claysmore Classic and Supercar Sunday, which is swiftly followed by the Gillingham and Shaftesbury show. If you're going, and obviously you should if you can, do come and say hello if you spot us around the showground. I promise we're friendly and we'd love it if you did. Straight afterwards, we'll be looking ahead at the Dorset County Show and, of course, rolling swiftly into our September issue before we can blink, as well as the Sturminster Newton Cheese Festival and squeezing in a trip to London for another awards ceremony. And then we just might go find somewhere quiet for a very long nap. And no, we are not going to discuss the fact that I have seen 2 high street chains appear in my social media feed this week with Christmas trees up and decorations for sale in store. However, you'll never find us complaining about a busy month. Well, not often. I admit I'm not a total ray of sunshine when running on too little sleep and too much caffeine. Though we've lived here for more than 30 years, the last 3 spent running the BV has allowed us to see like never before the rich tapestry of Dorset. We've had the privilege of getting to know so many of you, and every issue reveals more of the resilience and character, the strength, the goodwill and the sheer talent that defines our local businesses and communities. Contrary to popular perception, we locals know that Dorset is so much more than some beautiful beaches and a famous cobbled hill. It's a beautiful hub of innovation, creativity, determination. The awards we've won this year have been a welcome nod to our efforts over the last 3 years, of course. But actually the real reward lies in knowing that thousands of people appreciate what we do every month. We feel we've grown not just as a publication, but as a part of our community. We're committed to supporting local, sharing stories that matter, and being a voice for Dorset. Thanks for sticking with us.
Time for your letters to the editor.
And a letter for Ian Tattersall of Gillingham, who says, "Save the planet." It's a phrase used everywhere we look. I'm not an activist, nor an eco-campaigner, and I'm not about to start supergluing myself to the M25 or London Waterloo Express train. I do believe that we should all try and do our bit, relative to our means and circumstance. Maybe then we can save our grandchildren and great-grandchildren from the perilous fate that looms ahead. For our bit, we have swapped our diesel cars for electric ones since 2016. We have spent the last 11 years making our home more energy efficient as time and resources allowed. Our house has moved from an EPC rating of D in 2012 to A in 2022. For a 1980s built detached house, this is no mean feat. We have insulated under the floors, added more loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, fitted A+ rated double glazing and doors. We had 4 kilowatt PV installed in 2012 and, wherever possible, replaced older, inefficient appliances with A++ rated new ones. For the last year, we ran the whole house 24/7 from either solar power or off-peak electricity pulled in overnight at 1/5 of the price. This year, we've had an air source heat pump installed and added a second power wall to further support the running of this pump. We're adding to our solar system to try and reduce our pull on the grid some more. This should mean that we were able to export a lot more green solar-generated electricity back to the grid, helping everyone else reduce their carbon footprint too. However, our Energy Distribution Network Operator, SSEN, have put a stop to that. We were granted permission to install the extra panels on condition that the installers block our ability to export any electricity to the grid from them. The excess green electricity we generate from the new system will now be grounded to earth and lost, while somebody somewhere burns more oil, gas and coal to generate dirty electricity to keep up with demand. It's high time that pressure from the government was put on the likes of SSEN to up their game and upgrade the energy networks urgently so that they're fit for the future that is fast approaching.
Roger Tatler of Gillingham writes, "Now we seem to have got to the stage where houses can be built in a council's area even when all the council and residents object. Perhaps we should take a lesson from some French towns. There, the council buy some appropriate land, put in the road and facilities, and then grant individual permission to residents to build on the plots as and when the council sees fit. Stop this wholesale development by big building firms just out to make a huge buck regardless of what the locals want."
Catherine Langham sent in an email about the solar farm. Dorset Council Strategic Planning Committee has approved plans for a 188-acre solar development stretching for 1 mile from northeast to southwest on a site between Mappada, Pulham, Kingstag and Hazelbury Bryan. Scant consideration was given to local residents' very real concerns that existing high levels of flooding would be exacerbated by concentrated runoff from panels, creating runnels which would increase water levels quickly and cause flash floods. The area is already in a flood zone and the ground saturates for about 6 months of the year. The applicants have failed to provide adequate infiltration tests of the site or confirm the number of panels planned, so it's currently impossible to calculate the risk. The committee appeared to be more concerned with the relocation of crested newts or whether or not sheep would be grazed under the panels. At one point, debate surrounded the issue of potential fire in battery storage areas. Objectors and observers were surprised that planning and flood officers did not point out that there is in fact no battery storage planned in the application under consideration. Landscape officers and the AONB's concerns that significant damage would be caused to views from the Bullberry Ridge were brushed aside, with the comment that the panels would have a non-reflective coating. Significantly, neither the landscape nor heritage officers were present, and the AONB was not represented. Some will respond that the climate emergency means that renewable energy must trump every other consideration. But is this acceptable when giant solar plants destroy cherished views, fence wildlife out of their usual habitat, take good farmland out of production, at a time of food insecurity, and risk lives and livelihoods due to exacerbated flooding? National and Dorset planning policy states clearly that environmental damage must not be disregarded during the move to low-carbon energy generation. But in this case, elements of policy have been ignored. My personal view is that if larger than about 60 acres, these plants should be located close to motorways or other semi-industrial areas where the landscape, habitat and tranquility is already blighted. Subsidies should be offered to industry and agriculture to cover suitable roofs with solar panels. Taking into account their enthusiasm to cover unspoiled country with industrial panels, it's also surprising that Dorset Council does not insist on solar panels and water butts to be standard with every new dwelling and encourage farms and businesses to install panels on their buildings.
Karen Wimhurst of Shaftesbury writes regarding Simon Hoare's piece in the BV magazine of July 23. "We are watching wildfires ravaging parts of Europe yet again, as well as unmanageable temperatures in the USA, China and the global south. Clearly, ever-accelerating indicators show that the world is now on the cusp of a number of tipping points which will make runaway climate change inevitable. Recent research suggests the Gulf Stream may collapse as early as 2025 with catastrophic results. Professor Sir Robert Watson was clear on the Today programme last week. He thinks 1.5 as a goal is becoming unreachable due to lack of political will, and states that in this country the measures to ensure we reach our commitments to the Paris Agreement aren't there in any shape or form. Lord Debon of the UK CCC, until recently, stated our government was setting the worst kind of example to the rest of the world, compared to other countries who are really moving on green solutions rather than empty pledges, while actively supporting new oil and coal initiatives. This week, Rishi Sunak has clearly shown that, rather than creating opportunities for people across the UK to mitigate the seriousness of the situation we're facing, he prefers to fabricate an anti-green mantra to bolster an election campaign. I therefore find Simon Hoare's statement in the BV magazine July 2023, confidence in the commitment of the government to achieve progress cannot be in serious question, extremely surprising. It is at complete odds with anything these eminent climate scientists are saying, and the actions of his government.
Say the word kite to someone and they'd probably immediately think you were talking about the kind we fly on the end of a long piece of string. But say that word to a bird lover, and to them it's the red kite, that beautiful big bird of prey we increasingly see cruising up above, scanning the ground for food. Adam Woolcott, who's a conservation trainee with the Dorset Wildlife Trust's Warden team for North and West Dorset, falls into the latter category. Adam is a big red kite fan, and he agreed that the story of these birds in Britain is one of wildlife conservation's success stories. A good story for once.
Yes, it's fantastic. It's a real sort of conservation success story. So red kites were pretty much, entirely extinct in England, and they only had a remnant population in Wales. So in about 1903, they reckon that the breeding population in Wales, sort of mid-Wales, was estimated to be sort of single digits, with some genetic studies indicating that it might have been, 2 or 3 breeding pairs. Since then, there's been quite a lot of conservation effort to try and keep that population stable, and it's been increasing ever so slightly. So during the Second World War, that increased a little bit more, and it continued to increase due to lots of effort being put in to try and preserve them.
So Adam, the birds were perilously on the brink then, weren't they, over 100 years ago?
Yeah, they were incredibly rare at this stage. I mean, I've got an antique bird book which says, you're very, very unlikely to see these birds unless you go to a particular area in mid-Wales, and even then, it's a joy to see them because they're so rare. And now, when driving to work, I regularly see them in Dorset,
which is lovely. So, was that location in mid Wales kept very secret?
I believe, I'm not entirely sure actually as to how secret it was there, because they can range quite far. So, but
what is their range on an average day, if one can say that?
I mean, I know it sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, but as far as they need to go to find food. Entirely depends.
Fair enough.
Yes, I know. Yeah, similar to mine actually. It's about my range for the day.
And then Adam, they were so that little remnant population in Wales didn't really spill over into England, not for reasons of nationalism or anything like that. So then there were reintroductions which began 30 years ago, something like that. Now,
about 1989, there was a reintroduction program initiated by the RSPB. And what was then the NCC, so the Nature Conservancy Council, which is now sort of Natural England or Scottish Natural Heritage. So they reintroduced birds from predominantly Spain, but also Germany and Sweden, into about 9 locations over the course of about a decade or so across the UK, with the most local to us in Dorset being in the Chiltern Hills. So overall in England, I think they reintroduced about 330 birds. Mostly from Spain, but since then the populations have spread. They've bred really well. They've been really, really successful, and current estimates are around 4,400 breeding pairs in the UK,
which is fantastic. So tell me, Adam, the fact that they brought in red kites from Spain, they would have had different genetic makeup, different DNA, wouldn't they? Did that matter?
Would, yeah. I think when anyone's doing any introduction programs, they always do some sort of feasibility study prior to the reintroduction. So as one of the IUCN's guidelines for reintroductions, they've got a series of checklists that they need to do, one of which is trying to find donor populations with as similar genetics as they can. So I think they decided that as the Spanish population was so strong and they were genetically very similar to the ones that we think we had in England at the time, or should have had in England at the time, I think they reintroduced from Spain, Germany and Sweden.
Now, you say you see them when you're driving into work, and of course, if you hop over towards Oxford area, you see plenty of them cruising gracefully around in the air, looking for something to eat. What do they eat?
Yeah, well, they are beautifully agile flyers, but they're predominantly scavengers. So a lot of roadkill, a lot of sort of dead pheasants, dead rabbits, that sort of thing. But they'll also take small mammals, so sort of voles, that sort of thing, up to about the size of a small rabbit, and invertebrates, so earthworms and beetles. And you'll often see, I've seen them in the past, following the plough as well. So as the earthworms have been churned up, along with the seagulls, you'll often get red kites following that as well. So whereas buzzards will take rabbits and they'll do a lot more, they will be a lot more actively hunting, red kites will be much more scavenging, but they will take anything they can get their little talons on.
Sort of cleaning up what the others have
Yes.
neglected to take. Now, historically, red kites were always associated with rubbish dumps, weren't they? So I was wondering, have they had to, since we started tidying up rubbish dumps and having organised rubbish collections, have they had to diversify in what they eat?
I think there'll be a little bit of that, but equally there has been a lot more roadkill since we've started doing that. With the increase on cars on the roads, more roadkill is there out and about, and obviously pheasant shoots and things means that quite often pheasants get hit. There is some aspect of having to diversify a little bit, but I think the fact that the population is increasing means that there's clearly enough food for them going around and about.
And so you say there's roadkill, there's things like that, but they will also take earthworms and so on, will they?
Yes, yeah, they can take they'll take earthworms. They like any invertebrates. So earthworms following if they follow the plough, they'll often get earthworms, or if the ground's damp, they'll be able to dig them up. Yeah, it seems like
it sounds like rather a humble foodstuff for such a beautiful, big, noble bird, doesn't it?
It really does, doesn't it? Yeah. In medieval times, they were seen to be as common as the carrion crow, and they would fulfil a similar role. So they would eat a lot of carrion, particularly in London, and they were seen as quite an urban bird, fulfilling quite a good role as scavenging, dead animals, carcasses, rats, all sorts of things within London. In fact, they were, so popular at certain times that it was a capital offence to kill one.
I wonder at what point then that switched from them being really valued and to being persecuted and regarded as vermin. I wonder what the reason was for that switch of attitude.
Yes, I'm not entirely sure of the exact reason and when that happened. However, even during medieval times, I mean, there's a couple of references in Shakespeare to red kites, one of which being fairly positive and about how they build their nests, but another sort of gave really negative connotations about scavenging, so they were almost seen like a sort of cowardly bird. So I think it was in King Lear that they were talking, there was a reference to someone being like a kite and cowardly, so they had a negative connotation because they scavenged on the street.
Perhaps Shakespeare was just following the popular opinion of the birds at the time.
Yes, quite, yeah.
So Adam, to come sort of closer to home, what about red kites in Dorset? Do we have many breeding pairs?
We do, yes. Certainly in the last sort of 10, 20 years, the population in Dorset has increased by quite a considerable amount. I don't know the exact number of breeding pairs within Dorset because it's one of those quite difficult things to estimate. But they are regularly seen, especially in the north of the county. And actually, the Blackmore Vale is a fantastic spot to see them because they love sort of mixed farmland, woodlands. They need old trees and things in order to produce to make their nests. And I know that when we at the Dorset Wildlife Trust are on some of our reserves, such as Fontmell Down up near Shaftesbury, almost guaranteed to see at least a pair, often sort of 4 or 5. I mean, it's
Do they need hilly country, the sort of country where there are good updrafts going up the hills and they can take off from their tree?
Agile. Not really actually. They're quite strong flyers and they're very agile flyers. So in the antique bird book that I had, or that I have, They said they were sort of mountainous, they preferred mountainous regions, but the fact they're doing so well in lowland, it's more of a fact that there was a remnant population in mid Wales that was sort of just clinging on where there was less competition. But they like mixed farmland, grassland, woodlands. They do well on in hilly areas, and they will take advantage of updrafts. So often they'll be, you can see them sort of stock still in the air with just their really distinctive forked tail moving around just to manoeuvre, and they can be beautiful and agile. However, they're not confined to that sort of area. As long as there's enough food and enough nesting areas, generally they're happy anywhere they can, yeah.
But it's not going to be like the Middle Ages and we'll be about to see them in our towns any longer, is it?
No, although actually, as you say that, there's a quite good population in quite a lot of urban areas because of supplemental feeding. I was reading something the other day about red kites in particularly Reading, so near the Chilterns, where there was a big population to start off with. They reckon about 300 kites a day come into the city to forage for food, because a lot of people will throw bits of chicken or bits of offcuts from meat into their garden, because red kites will swoop down and take food from their garden.
Well, that would be quite something, wouldn't it?
It would be, yes. I'm not sure about the ethical implications of sort of providing supplemental food, but...
Yes, well, that's a wee bit of a tricky one. I think we'll leave that one alone, shall we, Adam?
That's probably very sensible, yeah.
But, I did hear from a friend a couple of years back some scaremongering stories from Oxford, where, as you know, there are plenty of red kites, that these stories accuse them of doing the same thing as herring gulls. In other words, diving down and stealing food from people and scaring them. Sounded to me like a bit of a fairy story, but is there any truth in that?
I think it is quite exaggerated, those sort of stories, but you do get the odd one here and there, odd story coming out here and there. I think particularly in areas where, going back to the supplemental feeding, they've got more used to foraging in urban areas. I mean, I read a story the other day where someone apparently had a bit of sausage taken off a barbecue because their neighbour feeds the red kites, and
so they came down to the barbecue and nicked a hot sausage.
Yeah,
that can't have gone down very well.
No, you wouldn't.
With either the bird or the people.
No, quite, yeah.
Now, Adam, if we go across the channel and go south in France, we'll see black kites as well as red kites. Did we ever have black kites in the UK?
There are the odd record here and there. I don't know if we know we ever had black kites breeding.
Now, what about persecution these days? Because the birds are legally protected, but there are, on some of the big shooting estates, there are gamekeepers who poison them deliberately, don't they?
Yes, that is one of the main issues facing red kites at the moment is, illegal poisoning. So because they're scavengers, obviously, even if the poison was left out, not necessarily intending it for red kites, it could be for foxes or carrion crows. They will often eat the poison bait and potentially, get very sick or die from it. Another issue that they face is rodenticide poisoning. So often people will use hemorrhaging chemicals which cause rats to hemorrhage, but because red kites are scavengers, they will feed on the dead rats, and the things like warfarin and equivalent sort of chemicals will get into their system and cause real issues there as well.
But luckily, such incidences are fairly few and far between.
They are.
And in the meantime, the birds the population continues to increase, and they continue to give us the pleasure of seeing them soaring gracefully overhead.
Oh, absolutely. And they are beautiful, beautiful birds. They are really, really stunning. The sort of russet red with the white and grey head, and just such agile flyers. They are, one of my favourites, I have to say. Real treat to see them.
Adam Woolcott of the Dorset Wildlife Trust.
Politics. Does every town need a town centre? Despite changes in retail habits, town centres continue to play an essential role, argues MP Simon Hoare. Many years ago, I attended a lecture given at the Royal Town Planning Institute. While it was not a sellout affair, I doubt attendance at such an event is on anyone's bucket list, the topic was an interesting one. Does every town need a town centre? It was not a rhetorical question, and the lecturer felt that the question was answerable in the negative. He felt that internet shopping, coupled with increased access to personal modes of transport, meant that retail and local services could be focused on 1 or 2 towns with quite a large geographical area. I did not and do not agree. Every town is different. It has evolved over varying timespans and for various reasons. Notwithstanding this, the needs of a town's inhabitants appear to be pretty universal. We need somewhere to meet and hold community events. We need food, so food retail is important. A pub or 2 and a few eateries provide space for socialising and entertainment. We need to be groomed and occasionally pampered. A post office or bank provides essential financial and other services. It's true that our retail habits have changed with the advent of the internet. Supermarket home delivery means that increasingly the big shop is undertaken online. The internet also plays an increasingly important role for banking, TV licence renewals, etc., as it will increasingly do so for health too. So our town centres are necessarily evolving to meet the needs of today. Doubtless, some current commercial properties will be converted, possibly reconverted, to residential use. This is to be welcomed, providing, as it does, sustainable living space and a sense of community and activity in the centres long after the shops have shut. Trying to win the pricing competition is an uphill struggle for small local independent traders, and it's not one they should embark on. Instead, a resolute focus on product knowledge, local supply chain, short food miles, and a personal level of service makes the local shopper feel valued and the experience a pleasant one. Some current commercial units are likely to be converted to provide entertainment, leisure, or, to use the real estate phrase, dwell time facilities. Our town councils have an important role to play too, ensuring the streets are clean, planters attractive, and that there's the odd bench here and there to attract people to their area. We are blessed in North Dorset. The principal towns of Blandford Forum, Sturminster Newton, Shaftesbury, Gillingham and Verwood all have unique character and charm. They also have standout town councils and councillors who play a key role. The restrictions of COVID lockdowns, they seem a lifetime ago, don't they, forced people to use their towns, and they liked what they saw and found. As more people work from home, the opportunity to shop locally and on one's doorstep presents itself, thereby maintaining footfall and supporting local business. We all have a role to play. Central government needs to provide flexibility within the planning rules and continued support for business rates. Dorset Council needs to be fleet of foot on planning and harnessing the energies of local entrepreneurs, benefactors and others to deliver sustainable change, ensuring the longevity of our centres. But above all, if we are to answer the question my lecturer posed in the affirmative, we need to use them or lose them.
Time for change, time for the grown-ups, says Mike Chapman of the North Dorset LibDems. In Ukraine, the people are fighting for their nation, for a future free from the disgusting influence of the criminal clique in Moscow. Thank you, Ukrainians, for showing us that democracy is worth fighting for. Dorset is doing its bit in support. More than 400 Ukrainian families have joined our West Country ranks and are starting to make their own contribution. Meanwhile, we had a great Lib Dem outcome in the Somerton and Frome by-election. What pleased me the most was the evident faith put in the strength and capability of our local candidate, Sarah Dyke. She is a genuine local of our land and our rural ethos, and will make a difference up in the smoke. More power to her elbow, I say. I spent the day telling outside a couple of polling stations, much of the time alongside my Conservative equivalent. It wasn't long into the morning before we all knew what was happening just from the various comments of people en passant. My oppo wasn't surprised or downcast. There was, however, a fatalism about the situation and a wish that the last 18 months in the Tory party hadn't happened. Our discussions range from illegal migration, France's fault, to climate change, China's fault. These may be the popular sentiments, but, of course, they lay the blame on the effect, not the cause. The real causes lie in complex geopolitics and in the West's combination of consumerism and post-industrial mindset. It is sad to hear of the likely rolling back of what Johnson labelled green crap as a result of the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election. It is typical of our short-termist, keep power at any cost politics that the knee-jerk reaction from the governing party is to appeal to the pound in your pocket today and stick it to the next generation. Tory to a T. Time to move on from government for the populists, by the populists, egged on by the populist press, on to something a bit more serious. So, first up, how about proportional representation as a means to get the whole country engaged in the process of government? Today's winner-takes-all system results in the disengagement of about 2/3 of the population because they're being governed by people they did not vote for. What about the virtues of strong government, I hear you cry? What virtues? The stonking majority of 2019 has created a monster, now controlled by its right wing. No wonder it just goes round in circles. Next stop for us is Mid-Bedfordshire, home to the dreadful Dorries, a powerful minister under Johnson, and once with the future of the BBC in her gift. More than time for change. It is time for the grown-ups. Time for Sarah Dyke and her like.
There's a dead cat and it smells of carbon, says Pat Osborne of the North Dorset Labour Party. The Rishi Sunak helicoptering in to announce a carbon capture project hypocrisy is a fine dead cat of a story. Cynically positioned alongside news of his first family holiday abroad in 4 years, it's clear that many ordinary holidaymakers in the same position will feel some sympathy for him. But it's pure distraction. The real story is Sunak's decision to grant 100 new North Sea oil and gas licences, demonstrating an ongoing investment by the government in irreversible damage to the planet. Firstly, 80% of North Sea oil is exported. If we needed more, there's clearly enough existing supply. Simply redirect it to the domestic market. And as for the gas, this was not, as advertised, a move that will ease household energy bills. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia provided just 4% of the UK's gas. Most of it comes from Norway. Prices rose due to the war in Ukraine because they're set by global traders. Will more gas from the North Sea mean cheaper domestic fuel bills? Unlikely. Rishi Sunak can't force the licensees, many backed by multinational companies, to sell it at a discounted price in the UK. They trade at the international prices. In the face of this tidal wave of environmental vandalism, the announcement of the new carbon capture project in St Fergus, Aberdeenshire, is like offering an egg cup to bail out an already sinking ship. In the same week that the Met Office announced that last year's 40-degree-plus UK heatwave will be considered on the cool side within a few decades, and the UN declared July 2023 to be the hottest month in human history, the Tories are clearly not taking climate change seriously enough. In light of this decision, and the others like it, the UK's net zero by 2050 target seems increasingly unachievable. Meanwhile, the recently reinforced commitment to ban sales of new petrol and diesel cars by 2030 seems more and more likely to buckle under pressure from the loony libertarian wing of the Tory party that's really running the show. Sunak's commitment to meet our net zero target in a pragmatic and proportionate way, but without unnecessarily adding costs and burdens to families, is also a nonsense. Even his own party chairman has admitted that his current policy will not take a penny off household bills, and neither will a continued commitment to oil and gas do anything to mitigate our reliance on fossil fuel oligarchs and dictators who do not share our democratic values.
The good, the bad and the downright ugly, says Ken Huggins of the North Dorset Green Party. The Uxbridge by-election had it all. It was good for the Conservatives, winning narrowly by focusing on the Labour Mayor of London's plans to penalise the 10% of most polluting cars by charging them to drive in the area. It was bad for Labour, of course, and it was downright ugly for anyone wanting common sense to dominate in our battle to stop climate change. Both parties have started rowing back on their already inadequate plans to tackle global warming, as if net zero would just be nice to have instead of an absolute necessity. Where was the grown-up conversation, for example, about the economic benefits of a fair transition to a cleaner world, or the costly, massive damage to lives and health from fossil fuel-driven air pollution? Aside from clean air, there are two other absolutely essential requirements for survival: clean water and healthy food. At the moment, we're doing our damnedest to deprive ourselves of those too. Water has hit the headlines recently, with decades of failed privatisation having seen waterway sewage pollution increase. Water companies have been loaded with billions of pounds of debt, while billions of pounds have been paid out in dividends to shareholders, most of them based overseas. As for food, we urgently need to reform what we eat, how it's produced, and where it's grown. Targeted support for farmers is key. More than a quarter of all the food we grow is never eaten. That's 13 million tonnes wasted. Industrialised farming is a major cause of damage to our soils and the pollution of our waterways with pesticides, fertilisers, and so on. Agriculture uses 71% of land in England, with 85% of that used for feeding and rearing livestock. Growing plants for human consumption generates around 12 times more calories per hectare than using the land for meat production. We presently import 46% of the fresh vegetables we eat and 84% of the fruit. Poor diet causes diabetes, cardiac disease, and other obesity-related conditions. It is blighting the lives of millions, predominantly our poorer citizens, and is costing the NHS billions. Unsustainable. The government knows all this, but isn't taking the action needed. Time for change. In episode 3 of July's BV podcast, we heard from Bournemouth University archaeologist Paul Cheatham about the Winterbourne Kingston Iron Age dig, nicknamed Duropolis. Paul is co-director of the dig. A host of interesting artefacts and bones, including human skeletons, have been unearthed over the years from the dig. It's a site that's worked in the summer months, and members of the public are invited to take part. Last time, Paul ended by saying that it was clear that the focus of these Iron Age farmers, the Durotrigans, was their animals. Now he tells us how they're trying to interpret the significance of the animal bones they've been unearthing in what are called the banjo enclosures at the site.
In previous years, we've dug the second of these banjo enclosures. 2 together have never been excavated before, so that's the first. But the other one, by the entrance, we found, I think, 17 horse skulls by the gateway. And those horse skulls, the teeth had fallen out, the jaws were missing. It was clear that they were displaying the horse skulls in some way at the entrance. It was clearly their status symbol. What people find surprising in the Iron Age in Dorset, there are no bows and arrows whatsoever.
None at all. No signs of no aggressive warfare signs.
No bows. No. The weapon of the common man was the sling. There are no bows and arrows, and there's no evidence of them hunting at all. We get the odd wild animal. It's very rare on the site, and they didn't eat any fish or seafood in any way. So they were very much farmers, and it seemed to be all their status and wealth was within their animals. And this is why we think that they make so much effort when they're filling in these pits to place the animals that they presumably venerate or they need within the deposits. And they will often combine different animals together. We often find horse skulls with cow jaws and the other way around, and they've actually reconstructed bits of animals and put them in the pits as an offering. So one year we found a horse. They're quite small, were Iron Age horses, more like ponies, in one of the pits, but it had been decapitated. So they'd obviously taken the head, probably to display, but in place of the head they put a cow skull.
I did read that there was a suggestion that sort of assembly of mixed animal species parts was hinted at a Celtic belief in animal monsters. Is there any truth in that suggestion?
Well, they look like monsters to us, but to them, I think I talk about a language of deposition. They knew what they were doing when they were putting these animal remains in the pits as offerings. But the thing about it is that really we don't understand this language. So again, just at the end of the dig, Amanda, the lady I was talking about who had brought her children, were helping her. Right at the bottom of her pit, when she exposed the animal remains, they placed very carefully in the middle of the pit a horse skull, upside down. They often do that. They like to put them upside down, teeth showing. But then around it, there were piles of animal bones collected. I think there were about 8 piles of, it would have been, where they just collected up from the site, just a bit of pig, a bit of horse, a bit of this, and they clearly put a sort of ring of little piles of bone. There was clear intention there, but what they were trying to communicate, presumably with the gods or with their ancestors, we are trying to decipher, but it is very difficult.
You've got a bit of a Rosetta Stone here, then, haven't you? You're not trying to decipher any written language, but physical symbols.
Yes, and as I say, this idea that they would combine animals, as I said, they're monstrous to us, but they probably saw it as some sort of fusion of, who knows, of the strengths of the different animals together or something like that, you know. So yes, I mean, for instance, we've had a few odd things that are being regarded as monstrous. For instance, we found a sheep which had a cow's skull placed up against its rear end, and so it looked very weird when we excavated it, a sort of sheep with a cow's head. But you know, I mean, it's the fact that they also buried humans within the settlement. Often they would bury small children, neonates or perinates, so children that presumably died in childbirth or just after. They would bury them very locally to where they were living. And that continued in the Roman period. Children who died young would often be buried under the floors of the houses. Again, we think this is a bit odd, but clearly you can see it as sort of odd, but you can also see it as possibly that they wanted to keep their child close to them. You know, there may be more of a you know, an emotional connection that we're not seeing.
And who knows, Paul, they may also have had a belief that the child's spirit remained close to the body.
Exactly. So you know, these we're trying to understand these behaviours. The thing about the Iron Age as well is that for most period of the Iron Age, we can't find any human remains. We don't know what they did with the bodies. There were clearly large families up there. The downland up there was probably more occupied than it is today in terms of population density, but we don't find many human remains. They didn't have formal cemeteries, which is a bit of a strange thing.
But you have unearthed human skeletons, haven't you?
Well, only a very tiny number for the main part of the Iron Age. So up until just before the Romans came, about 50 BC, when there is a change in behaviour. Before that, literally, there are no bodies. There are no cemeteries. We don't know what they did with most of the people. We find odd burials in the pits, which seem to be possibly, for some reason, they've decided that this person will go in a pit. We've had 2 that do appear to be sacrifices or executions, but the rest of them are absolutely fine. But we've only had about 10, and that's over a period of, you know, 500 years. There's clearly got to be a lot more people. I
wonder if perhaps they took them down to the coast and floated them out to sea.
Well,
so there was no pollution of their precious land.
Well, of course, you get bog bodies in the Iron Age, where bodies are placed disposed of in watery places, often with ritual associated with it. So the fact that they don't eat fish or seafood may mean that they are disposing of the bodies within rivers or at sea. There's also, if you're familiar with the sort of Battersea Shield and other Iron Age objects that have been pulled out of the Thames, that they were putting offerings of quite expensive objects in rivers that may have gone in with human remains, but unfortunately within that environment they don't survive. But they certainly weren't cremating them. We would find the fragments of burnt bone. They're not exposing them because again we tend to find odd elements of human remains about, and we don't. So we as I say, we've got about 10 burials from this early Iron Age period that have gone in pits. So they're very special, and we are having them fully analysed to look at where their origins come from and their DNA. But later in the Iron Age, just before about 50 BC, they suddenly changed their belief system completely, and this is an exciting thing we're trying to sort out. And they suddenly decided, no, we're going to bury our dead. What we're going to do is we're not going to put them in pits. We're going to dig individual graves, fresh hole. We're going to put the burial in. We're going to put it in a particular way. They're always going to be on their side. And next to them, we're going to give them a pot with presumably some sustenance for the afterlife. Or if we don't give them a pot full of some sort of food stuff, we'll give them a side of meat. And if you're a female, you'll get a side of lamb. And if you're a male, you'd normally get a side of pig. And we'll put you in a shroud. And we often find the pins that held the shroud together. And you've probably laid in state for a few days because these bodies are tightly bundled up in a way that suggests that there must have been a certain amount of decomposition before they went in the ground. And we'll put them in little cemeteries. And the cemeteries, what we'll do with the cemeteries, we'll go to an old monument that's out of use, that's probably been out of use for 200 years, and we'll place your bodies there, presumably with the ancestors. And that was what was going on when the Romans turned up. So we've now got 3 of these late Roman cemeteries, and again we've been able to take DNA and get radiocarbon dates, and we're getting a wonderful picture of how the society worked at that period. And we are currently writing the paper for that, so that will be coming out soon, but it's all sort of under wraps at the moment.
Oh, it's all very exciting for you, Paul. Finally, you mentioned to me just the other day that you'd made, just last week, made a rather exciting discovery. Would you tell me about that one?
I'm not sure. What do you remember what it was? There's so many exciting discoveries.
No, you just mentioned you'd made a really.
Well, I think that the thing that we found was this, as I say, was this pit with the skull and the piles of bones, because as I say, a lot of the time you will find a skull and a jaw and something like that, and you'll think, well, yeah, was this intentionally put there? You could argue it was, it wasn't, but as I say, this deposit with the skull upside down in the middle and the little piles of bones is probably the clearest evidence of intentionality. There's clearly some sort of ceremony, clearly a ceremony going on where they're collecting up the bones and placing them in these in this way right at the bottom of the pit, and then they're filling it in. And as I say, you couldn't. There's no way that you could argue that there was not intentionality there. This is not some accidental act. This is very clear insight into, hopefully, give us ideas of what they were thinking about, how their cosmology, how they related to the world and the universe, to the heavens and the earth. And as I say, the more of these pits we've dug now, we're getting so much information about the way these deposits are put together. We may be able to get some ideas. We'll never know. The past has gone. It's a distant place that's getting farther away every year, and the evidence is getting less to an extent. But it does give us this is the wonderful thing about archaeology. We get this. There are no absolute truths in the past. We just have evidence that. So we get scientific evidence, but then you have to interpret it with a sprinkle of imagination and creativity to bring it back to life again. And I think that's the wonderful thing about archaeology and working on the sites that we are working on.
But gradually, of course, the more that you unearth here, the more that you can try and draw aside the veil that hides this past of over 2,000 years ago. Yes,
hopefully, yeah. Particularly with the modern techniques, as I say, from the geophysics that I used to allow us to very carefully target excavation. In the past, it was very haphazard. Sites would just, come across accidentally or within development. We're on this hillside, we're able to make sure we target everywhere, and that's meant that we do have this set of human remains going from the Bronze Age through to the late Roman period. So we can start to address questions. Are these all the same people, or are they waves of invasion? So, in inverted commas, incomes coming in. How does the society work? Who's the head of the household? How do is it the men or the women that are moving about? How do the families work? Can we trust the commentary of people like Caesar about how the Iron Age society worked? Because we can actually test that out now. And often, as I say, the reality is a lot more interesting than probably the simplistic ideas that have been offered in the past. Reality is often more interesting than anybody can make up, as is often the case.
Paul Cheatham, co-director of the Winterbourne Kingston Duropolis Iron Age Dig. And we may be hearing from him again later this year with some very interesting news about their finds.
Well, that's it for part 1 of the August BV Magazine podcast. Join us for episode 2 in about 2 weeks' time. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Terry Bennett.
And until next time, goodbye from me, Jenny Devitt.